woke left said you're being victimized because you're black or because you're a woman or because you're trans. Well, the woke right says you're being victimized because you're a white man. There is no constructive element to it. It's a destructive force.
I wanted to ask you about the problem of historical revisionism.
Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War.
World War II is a war where almost nobody until recently would say that is a war we should not have fought. Tucker Carlson was somebody who was incredibly rabid in pushing the war in Iraq.
I mean, they can just shut the f*** up and obey, is my view.
I think he's attempting to rid himself of that culpability by now being against every military operation that could possibly happen.
I did want to ask you about the grooming gangs.
I'd like there to be quite a lot of justice, Brendan. Deportations of the people we can deport. I want to see people stripped of their citizenship if they have dual nationality. I want some very, very harsh sentences to be handed out. We have not just a two-tier policing system, we just have a two-tier system in general.
Yeah. Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Konstantin Kisin. Konstantin, welcome to the show.
Good to be back. Thanks, Brendan.
Wonderful to have you back on. I think there are a million things I want to ask you about. You seem to be involved in pretty much every digital controversy going these days. I want to dig into a few of those with you. But let's start with a broad question, I guess. You and I have been talking about wokeness for a very long time. One of my great privileges to have been a very early guest on Trigonometry back when you were in some small room in some part of London. I can't even remember where it was. And back then we were talking about, I guess, what would now be bundled up as wokeness, you know, the trans ideology, new forms of censorship, cancel culture, all those kinds of things, which we've both been talking about for some time. There's lots of rumors now about wokeness's death. It seems to be fizzling out, according to some people. There are great heralds of the end of wokeness. Where do you stand on that question? Where do you think we stand in relation to that ideology?
Well, the longer we go, the more I'm convinced by the ideas that it's a very bad idea to make predictions, especially about the future. So that phrase resonates with me more and more. So I don't know, truthfully. I really think it's a highly dynamic situation, and it fundamentally depends on a number of things. First of all, how does the Trump presidency go? Because I can see it going either way. If the Trump presidency is widely perceived to be a massive success, that may well be the end of wokeness as we know it. Alternatively, if Trump's presidency is perceived as having gone too far, as it may well do, particularly on things like deportations and illegal immigration, right? There is, I think, a broad consensus across the United States and more broadly in the West about the need to deal with the problem of illegal immigration that's plaguing all of our countries. But I also think that some of the images and some of the perceptions that are coming out of what's happening in America are detrimental to that cause. And so if Trump is perceived as having dealt with illegal immigration in a firm but fair way, that's one thing. If he's perceived as having dealt with that issue in a cruel and illiberal and unjust way, which could also happen, I think it has the potential to go the other way. Right. And there are lots and lots of other things that could happen over the next few years that I think will fundamentally affect the course of how this goes. So the truth is, I simply don't know. But has wokeness been defeated to the point that it can't make a comeback? I don't think so.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. And when you say that it depends to a certain extent on how the Trump presidency goes, do you mean that if there are seen to be excesses in the Trump presidency, if they're seen as being too cruel on some questions or too hard on other issues, do you think that there might be an overcorrection were the Democrats to get back into power? Or is there a cultural establishment waiting to overcorrect what Trump has done, do you think?
I think the general sense is that, if, like I say, I think if Trump is effective and not seen to have gone too far, then the response will be, oh, okay, well, we need to update our thinking. We need to, think in a different way. We need to maybe go with a more economically minded and super socialist approach of the kind of AOC Mamdani vein. But if he is seen as validating all the false claims that have been made about him prior to this point, that he's a Nazi, that he's a fascist, that he's a racist, all of these things, then the woke idea will be, well, look, we told you he was all these things, and look how he's proved it by, deporting people to a jail in another country to which they've never been, depriving people of their civil liberties, going too far on this, going too far on that. And of course, the biggest question of all, Brendan, is what happens to the economy? Because that is not a settled question remotely at this point. We do not know what the impact of his policies will be. If there is a genuine, strong economic growth in America, which is really the main reason people voted for him at the last election as overwhelmingly as they did, if he delivers for at least his base, which is quite a broad base at this point, then that's one thing. But if the economy does not do well, if wealth inequality continues to go up, you are likely to see a return of some of those progressive narratives. So I think that's probably where it's at in America. In Britain is a different conversation. It fundamentally depends on who wins the next election, because what happens with Keir Starmer's government, I think, is pretty clear. I don't think it's going to be a competent, successful government that rebuilds this country or deals with any of the problems it proposed to deal with. Apparently, I don't know if you've heard, the way of dealing with illegal immigration is to continue to have illegal immigration, but just make it legal. I don't think that's really going to answer the questions that people are asking. So is there effectively a reform win and probably a reform landslide at the next election that it takes to address some of these issues or not, I think is where it's going to be decided. So some of the excesses have been reined in. We've got to be honest, right? On trans ideology, particularly medicalization of children, the battles have been won in the UK and elsewhere. But yes, I certainly would not want to conclude that wokeness is over. It could be over, but it could also make a very strong comeback depending on how things go.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, I want to ask you what you think of the MAGA movement right now, and I guess about the Trump presidency more broadly, how you think it's playing out. I find myself flitting on the Trump presidency because some days I feel incredibly excited, like when they released that executive order on trans women, so-called trans women in girls' sports. One of the most brilliantly written political documents I've ever read, just an extraordinary piece. Then other days they just wind me up. I think Trump's being an idiot again. They do stupid stuff. You know, it's hard to read in the round about how it's going. Where do you see the MAGA movement going? Do you think it has a positive role to play? Is it losing the plot?
Well, and beyond that, not to get too granular, but you'd also weirdly have to separate the MAGA movement from President Trump. We saw this, of course, over the strikes on Iran, where there were portions of the MAGA movement that were, melting down, predicting that this was the end of all humanity, World War III is upon us, etc. And President Trump had to stare those people down and eventually, of course, be proven right and prove them as a bunch of crying panicans that they always were. That was something that, that was a potential fracture in the MAGA movement that could have been an issue. If you're talking about the Trump presidency, I think you're right to analyze it issue by issue. I think President Trump was extremely effective on Israel in this instance. And my hope still is that he's able to orchestrate not some kind of pointless ceasefire that achieves nothing, but actually a complete resetting of the relationships in that entire region so that the countries of the Middle East, many of whose rulers at least are clearly moving in a pro-Israel direction. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Syria, and others. Can he orchestrate some big agreement to follow up on the Abraham Accords, where effectively everyone but Iran in the region, maybe everyone but Qatar in the region and Iran, essentially recognizes the existence of Israel, finds some sort of solution to the problem in Gaza, and creates long-lasting peace there? I'm hopeful that he's actually going to be able to do that. Take another foreign policy issue on Ukraine. I think he's been taken to the cleaners by Vladimir Putin. He appointed this by all accounts, very well-meaning but completely clueless friend of his called Steve Witkoff to try and negotiate with people in Moscow who've been at this for 30 years. And Steve Witkoff kind of got this kind of dazzling tour of the Kremlin, and then he got lots of Putin's time. But as Donald Trump said recently, President Putin is always nice, but he never does any of the things that we agree. And it looks like Trump is finally realizing that the MAGA narrative about Ukraine, which was the stupid idea that the reason the war is not coming to an end is Zelensky, some evil, corrupt dictator, is not remotely true. Zelensky agreed to everything that the Trump administration wanted, and yet the war is ongoing for the reason that we always knew it was ongoing, which is Vladimir Putin wants it to keep going because he wants to conquer Ukraine. So on that issue, I think the naivete, forgive me for framing it in this way, of the Trump administration has been found out. On immigration, as we've been talking about, I think it's a mixed bag. I think, look, I am here in Britain and across, if I were citizens of America, I'd be thinking, why have millions of illegal immigrants come to my country and why are they still here? I think it's a perfectly valid question for anyone to be asking. And, you know, in the process of dealing with that, there is the risk that you go so far so quickly that you perhaps start to make mistakes on individual cases, which of course is a bad thing. I want illegal immigration to be dealt with. I don't want innocent people to suffer. That's the position, as I understand it, of most Americans. And so there have been mistakes made. And the question is there a mechanism to correct those mistakes as quickly as possible? Or is there a kind of, let's pretend they're not happening, which I have seen, unfortunately, within the MAGA movement on the right? Oh, you know, I don't care about, as the Stalinists said in the Soviet Union, when you chop wood, bits of wood will fly, meaning that, you know, a few people being treated in this way is acceptable. I don't think so. I think you've got to deal with illegal immigration. And if mistakes are made, you've got to rectify them as quickly as possible. You've got to offer compensation, restitution, all of that. So on that issue, I think it's a mixed bag. On the economy and the tariffs, I don't think it's particularly clear what is going to happen. And I just think, you know, we've got to give it time. I am a firm believer, Brendan, of the idea that actually, generally speaking, my preference would be that we elect people for 4 or 5 year term, whatever it is in the country that we're speaking about. We let them have a proper go at it, refrain from commenting as much as possible. I say this about Keir Starmer, who I'm not politically aligned with remotely, neither I am aligned with Trump, of course. I'm prepared to let him have a go and then see where we are a few years down the line. And at that point, we'll make a decision of whether we like it or not.
Yeah, you know, radical proposition that we should do something, you know, do something about issues like illegal immigration without, you know, giving into inhumanity. I mean, I think that is what most people think on these questions. I want to come back to Britain in a moment, but I want to tease out some points you've made there and elsewhere about the MAGA movement, and especially that divide that exists between the MAGA movement and the Trump presidency on certain issues. And you mentioned the one of Iran. I thought sections of the America First, so-called America First MAGA movement made complete fools of themselves on that question. You know, Tucker Carlson infamously said that if America bombs Iran, millions will die. The only thing that died was Tucker Carlson's reputation. You know, the panic mongering that these people went in for, not only when America dropped bombs on Iran, but when Israel surgically struck the leadership targets in Iran. Even then, they were going crazy and saying this was an unprovoked unilateral attack, when of course it wasn't. Iran has been attacking Israel very often over the past few years. What do you think that particular moment, the Iran question, and I guess the Israel question more broadly, which is a huge one for the MAGA movement, what do you think that tells us about where the MAGA movement is going and whether Trump should just cut it loose on these questions? Well,
Trump's certainly not going to cut it loose. And one of the great benefits of the Trump, and I don't think it's unfair to call it a personality cult. There are many, many people in America who are so loyal to him. They will effectively, if he says the sky is blue today and tomorrow says it's green, they will go along with both on each subsequent day. And the benefit of that is he can take that movement pretty much wherever he wants. I think that's certainly true. I wish I were as optimistic as you about the career and reputation of people like Tucker Carlson. I think they get to spew this nonsense over and over and over and never actually be held to account, because many of the people who listen to them don't really consider their statements to be something that should be held against them in the future. So Tucker Carlson can spew all this nonsense today and then still be considered an authority within the MAGA movement tomorrow. The fact that he was proven completely wrong, the fact that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene were proven completely wrong, the fact that comic Dave Smith, who called President Trump to be impeached, was proven to be completely wrong. All of these people are going to continue to have a major voice on the right in America. I don't know why exactly. I don't want to be insulting or demeaning to the people who listen to them, but it is hard to understand how you could listen to somebody and take their opinion seriously when they said with such confidence and such vehemence that A, B, C, D, and E will happen. And in fact, quite the opposite will happen. And President Trump, of course, proved himself to be entirely correct on all these issues. And he proved that peace through strength means that you actually have to use that strength every now and again to deal with and intimidate people who want to threaten peace. That is what I think he did in Iran. And that, of course, is what Israel, as you rightly say, is doing. It is dealing with its enemies who've been attacking it for a very long time. So what happens with the MAGA movement over time is a difficult one. I think it's partly a generational thing. Americans who are sort of 35, 40 and older are instinctively very pro-Israel. I think there is a section of the American youth on the left and right who is instinctively very anti-Israel for very different reasons. Of course, as I don't need to tell you, the woke left is very anti-Israel on the basis that strength is bad. And therefore Israel defending itself robustly is bad. And of course, we shouldn't generalize. There are also a lot of people who just are confronted for the first time by the reality of war recorded in high definition on their smartphones that is being fed to them 24/7. And they perhaps lack the historical context and all sorts of other context to be able to contextualize it and to understand that, yes, war is bad, but then the question you have to ask is who is responsible for the fact that this is happening, which is, of course, Hamas. On the right, there is this conspiratorial fringe that has been looking for somebody to blame for all the ills of America for a very long time. And they've been dancing around. I wrote an article a long time ago called Tucker Carlson and the Woke Right, in which I talked about the fact that the woke right at that point hadn't quite understood or coalesced around a single point of blame. They kept talking about globalists and all of these other things, but they couldn't quite pin it down. What happened with the war in Israel is it gave a lot of the latent anti-Semitism that it was already rife within that movement a focal point. And now, of course, everything is the Jews' fault, which is where it's ended up. So there is this, and for now, they're still using Israel. Eventually, I suspect they will simply convert that into just Jews, which a lot of them are already doing. Which is to say that, the reason that we have mass illegal immigration, the reason that the economy has been not as successful as we want it to be, the reason that this, the reason that the reason all of these things are happening are because of Israel, i.e. because of the Jews. And it gives a very stupid people a very easy way of understanding, as they think, very complicated geopolitical issues, very complicated domestic issues, very complicated issues of every kind. And it's interesting, of course, that they will focus on Israel while observing their biggest and most important city being taken over by a radical left-wing insane socialist like Zohar Mamdani, which is fascinating to me that while that is happening in the most Jewish city in America, they're still obsessed about the Jews. It just tells you about the sort of prevalence and the strength of this ridiculous sentiment.
Yeah, that's a very good description, I think, of the scapegoating of Israel, which, as you say, we see on both the left and increasingly on the right, and what you have referred to as the woke right in particular. How bad do you think that could get? I mean, we've seen the comedian Dave Smith, who you mentioned, who is, rabidly anti-Israel in a way which just doesn't often stack up factually, never mind, morally, or politically. And he has a large platform now, largely on the basis of his Israelophobia. There are many other people like that. But there are others who have started openly saying Jews, as you say. And some of those people get a platform some of them have even been offered a platform on Joe Rogan's podcast. Some of them have appeared on Piers Morgan's show. And I think it's absolutely within the rights of all presenters to have on their shows whoever the hell they want to have on their shows. So I have no issue with that at all. But how much worse do you think this kind of creeping anti-Semitism could get? How much more explicit could it get? Could it become the defining ideology of some sections of the right?
I think it already is the defining ideology of some sections of the right. The question is how big and important and valuable those sections are. I think, I know for a fact that those sections don't really have any purchase with the current administration. But as I say, it's also a generational thing. I certainly think that once President Trump leaves office, there is a very real possibility that those voices become far more prominent, or not. It really fundamentally depends. So far, I think ultimately they have to, they will inevitably end up discrediting themselves with their hysteria and all of this other nonsense. And by the way, I certainly wouldn't group Dave Smith into that. I think he's very ill-informed, but he represents a somewhat different movement in America, which is there is a very strong anti-war worldview, and it's been ongoing for decades now. And look, I think these people are fundamentally mistaken and ignorant, and they don't really understand how the world works, and they don't understand how important it is for the prosperity and safety and security of Americans that America maintains its empire around the world. They don't make the connection between their incredible living standards and the fact that America controls global resources, global trade. It has incredible global influence by using its power abroad, which of course it has to do to maintain those things. But nonetheless, you know, I have said this before. I was on tour with Jordan Peterson last year for some of the medium-sized towns in America, and it does get a lot harder to argue for, you know, supporting Ukraine when you're in Oklahoma. It's hard to explain to somebody on the ground in the middle of America why their tax dollars, and increasingly the fear is, I think because of Vietnam, that their sons and husbands will be sent to fight elsewhere. That's a big concern, which is not very logical given what's going on, but that is the fear that actually drives a lot of people. It is hard to explain to people in that situation why it is that they should really care about a country on the other side of the world, which they've never been to. Many of them couldn't even find it on the map. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. There's countries I couldn't find on the map. And I don't particularly concern myself with what's happening in Peru right now. Do you know what I mean? So from an American's perspective, that anti-war grouping will always be there. I think the anti-Semitic fringe is a somewhat different, although correlated group of people, and how important they are. I think they're massively over-indexed in our debates, partly because, you know, people like Piers and others, they get their guests a lot from the online discourse that they see, which is not, in my experience, remotely reflective of what's happening on the ground in America. When I go there, I do not meet a lot of these people, even though I meet a lot of people who are on the right. They do exist, but I don't think they represent as many people as you might get the impression that they do from online discourse, particularly because I do think, especially on X, there is a gigantic bot problem that is not being addressed.
I wanted to ask you about the problem of historical revisionism in relation to all of this. This is something you've written about. You've spoken about it too. You know, that reimagining of the Second World War in particular as a mystified, misunderstood period. Churchill wasn't as good as we've all been led to believe. Hitler's been, you know, libeled over the course of time. I mean, the obvious example is Darryl Cooper, who does have some online clout for sure. He does get certain platforms. He does say things which, in my view, are mad as hell, and not stacked up by historical facts at all. There's an audience for that, isn't there? It may not be a huge audience, but there definitely is one. And I've even personally encountered people who say to me, well, you know, Churchill did this, Churchill did that. And I'm open to having a discussion about things Churchill did. But this is driven by a desire to, you know, completely rebalance our understanding of the entire 1940s. What do you think's going on there? What's motoring that? And again, I guess, how bad can something like that get in the future?
Well, it's a very important question, Brendan. And my work in theory on this is there are people who are doing it for different reasons. There are people for whom conspiracy and transgression are of themselves end goals. They enjoy the feeling that they've discovered something new and transgressive. And of course, as we've lived through a period of deep censorship and wokeness, where you can't say this, you can't have an opinion about that, you can't challenge this, you can't question that, people are increasingly confusing saying something transgressive or saying something true. Yeah. Because in an environment where saying something true produces a backlash, it is confusing to a lot of people who haven't thought carefully about this. And they think, oh, if saying something true produces a backlash, that means anything that produces a backlash is true. And of course it isn't. But there's another thing, and this is where we come back to the anti-war conversation, because a big part of what drives this is Vietnam was a deeply traumatic experience for America. Not only was it a war that America is perceived to have lost, but it produced an entire generation that were effectively traumatized by their dads coming back with PTSD. The entire country was traumatized by it. Then you have what is widely perceived to be the fruitless and terribly ended invasion of Afghanistan and the completely pointless and counterproductive and illegal invasion of Iraq, right? If there's such a thing as an illegal invasion, which is a whole other separate conversation, but entirely pointless. Americans lost their lives for nothing. And in fact, this is widely perceived to have produced a lot of problems. So there is this big anti-war faction. Now, the problem is that I think both and I would recognize is that there are times, and this has been something that people have understood throughout history, that being strong and using military force is the right thing to do. That does not mean that using military force and being strong is always the right thing to do. It does not mean that the response to every problem is to bomb the shit out of whoever it is that's causing you the problem. However, the difficulty is if you have this anti-war mindset that is built on Vietnam, that is built on Afghanistan, that is built on Iraq, that is built on regime change in the Middle East, that is built on the destabilization of a number of countries there, then every problem starts to look like a nail. As it does to a man with a hammer. Now, World War II poses a unique challenge to this worldview because World War II is a war where almost nobody until recently would say that is a war we should not have fought. And so if you're an anti-war position and you say to me, war is bad, we must never go to war, and I say to you, well, what about World War II? That takes you out of of the path on which you're on, and you can't then continue arguing for your point. That's why I believe there is a great popularity for revisionism World War II, because it essentially takes away the central argument in this anti-war position. And so you have to revise it, and you have to make up these stupid, historically illiterate lies, like actually Hitler wanted peace, Churchill was the one that wanted to continue the war, and all this other nonsense, which of course, if you read history, you know isn't true. But I believe that is what the purpose of this historical revisionism is. And that's why Tucker Carlson has been the central driver of this narrative, because the so-called anti-war position, look, this is totally unfair. And I'm only saying this from an outside observation. I don't know how true this is, but Tucker Carlson was somebody who was incredibly rabid in pushing the war in Iraq, which I opposed probably as rabidly as he pushed it at the time. And so his argument is essentially based, I think, on a guilt about his complicity in that invasion. And so having driven through the media that invasion to happen, I think he is attempting to rid himself of that culpability by now being against every military operation that could possibly happen, despite what it is, or at least should do to his reputation when he gets it as badly wrong as he's done recently. But the reason he's driving this historical revision through his platform, I think, is that he's attempting to undermine our narrative about World War II, because in doing so, he would undermine the credible case for military intervention where it actually is necessary, as it was with Iran.
Yeah, I think that's a very apt analysis of what's going on there. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that the Iraq experience in particular, but then if you're a bit older, I guess the Vietnam experience as well, has given rise to an anti-war sentiment that is actually quite defeatist. It's driven, it seems to me, less by principle than by the memories of these wars, both of which had disastrous consequences in various different ways. Iraq, I agree with you, was completely pointless and very destructive and unjustified. And that then becomes a narrative about how all military conflict is unjust. All military conflict is problematic and serves no purpose, which is just not true, either historically or in the contemporary moment either. How do you, in relation, just to stick one more moment with the historical revisionism, how does that feed into the woke right? Or I guess to ask it in a different way, how do you see the woke right going? If you could just say to us what you mean by woke right. I know you've explained it a million times to various different interrogators and different people who've asked you. I know what you mean by it. I sometimes find it a slightly confusing term because it makes me think of like members of the Conservative Party who are woke, like, you know, David Cameron hugging a husky or saying we're going to be super green, or some Tory saying trans women are women. So you think of people on the right who are woke. but you mean something quite specific. So just explain to us a little bit about what you mean by that term and how you think these different things feed it and feed into it.
Okay, well, let me give you what I perceive to be the defining features of the woke narrative in its original conception. The woke narrative is fundamentally about a number of things. One of them is the adoption of identity politics and the framing of identity as a proxy for victimhood.
Yeah.
In other words, let's say it like this. There are some groups in society, Brendan, that are disadvantaged and oppressed. And the reason they're disadvantaged and oppressed is because of their identity. And there are other groups which are advantaged and the oppressors, and it is their identity that makes them the advantaged and the oppressors. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is, of course, I don't know if you remember this, I'm sure you do, and your audience will too. Historical revisionism about Churchill and World War II is something that's been happening for quite a long time, and mostly not from the right. It's been happening precisely from the woke left, from people who say Churchill was a racist, Churchill was a mass murderer, Churchill hated Indians, Churchill did this, Churchill did that. It's an attempt to revise the past in order to fulfill the needs of the present time for political reasons. So the identity politics combined with victimhood, combined with a kind of cancel culture which says that if you're not with us, we must not disagree with you, we must destroy you. This is very much a feature of wokeness as I think of it. And so it's not about people on college campuses with blue hair. It's about people who think your identity is really important. You are being uniquely victimized because of who you are. And we've got to adapt all the realities and complexities and nuances of life into the simplistic narrative to make it work. Well, the woke right is people who say that you are being victimized because of, so the woke left said you're being victimized because you're black or because you're a woman or because you're trans or because you're this or because you're that. Well, the woke right says you're being victimized because you're a white man. And you're being victimized by these other people. It's, initially it was the left and it was globalist. Now it's Israel. That's why Israel is now responsible for everything in these people's minds, because it's a very simple explanation of why their lives are not the way they want them to be. And identity is crucial to this. It's all about the fact it's the native population, the white people, the white men, etc. And by the way, it's important to say, a lot of these woke right people will say to me in a private conversation, well, but the difference is when we talk about the fact that white men are being oppressed by society, it's true. And my answer to that is, well, actually, I agree with you to some extent. I do agree with you. We have lived through a period of time when calling somebody white a white man has been an insult. I've experienced it. I've been on the end of people trying to dismiss what I say on that basis. But this exact argument also applies to the woke left. The woke left had some arguments which were true. It is true, I think, that if you're an ethnic minority or a woman, you probably don't get quite exactly the start in life in many contexts that you would. But the question is, do you overgeneralize and over-extrapolate from that? And do you tell those people that the way to respond to that is by anger and vitriol and resentment? Or is the answer to that to attempt to correct the system and to make sure everyone is treated fairly and not seen first and foremost through their identity, but is treated as an individual, which is what I believe we ought to be doing, right? So that's what I see in terms of the parallels between the two. Now, look, people love to argue about the term. Everyone's got people call it the freak right, the dissident right. Some people call it the retard right. Whatever you want to call it, I don't really care. What I care about is we agree that the phenomenon exists. And then we actually understand that this group, in my opinion, can never be allowed to be part of the mainstream conversation, not because their opinions are so abhorrent, although I do think their opinions are just as stupid and pointless and counterproductive as the woke left's opinions, but simply because there is no constructive element to it. It's a destructive force which does not seek to build a better world. It seeks simply to undermine and destroy what already is. And I think these people are not helpful. I think they're incredibly dangerous because they're not helpful. And I don't think they should be welcomed in any movement that seeks to improve the world, which I would like to be part of.
Yeah. I call them the crank right. And I think you're right. It doesn't really matter what we call them so long as we understand what we're talking about. And I think you've just outlined it there incredibly well. Okay, let's now talk about a little bit about the crank left. You've mentioned Zoran Mamdani. I feel like I'm going insane whenever I read about Zoran Mamdani because I just think people aren't taking seriously enough what this guy represents and the fact that he could potentially become mayor of historically one of the most open, brilliant, fantastic cities on earth. To me, it's a terrifying prospect. This is someone who is up to his neck in woke ideology. He's written essays about whiteness and the problem of whiteness, etc. He refused to condemn the term globalize the intifada. He said it's just a cry for civil rights and equality, etc., etc. He's into the trans stuff, etc. I mean, he may well be the kind of thing you were talking about at the start of the conversation, you know, wokeness swooping back in and I guess shitting over everything that we think we might have achieved over the past few years. How worried are you about Mamdani and I guess about the Mamdani phenomenon, who he represents in New York and what he's proposing to do there?
I'll be honest with you, Brendan. I actually see it slightly differently. I don't think his election has a lot to do with wokeness, believe it or not. My sense is there are a number of things happening that, and I'm still fleshing out my perspective on what's happening. I read a great article by Fraser Nelson today in the Times in which he talks about the fact that much of this has been predicted as a consequence of elite overproduction. In other words, when you educate way too many people at universities and they don't have good jobs at the end of that process and they can't therefore afford to live to the standards that they've come to expect, you get a lot of these social movements. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, I think we have to be honest and say that life for a lot of young people seems to us like it's easy and wonderful because we didn't have many of the luxuries that they now have when we were young and when we were growing up. But the reality is there's one thing that they don't really have access to in anything like the way that even my generation, I'm a kind of geriatric millennial, but if you go older than me, there are a lot of people in Britain, for example, who benefited from the fact that you could buy a property, pay off the mortgage relatively quickly because the ratio of wages to house prices was quite manageable. You might be able to buy another property and rent it out because that was something that you could do. The government will prop up the housing market indefinitely because it's in the interest of people who currently own property and they vote and they have influence and power in society. And so a lot of young people, I wrote an article about this called on my Substack called Why Socialism is Getting Popular. And I think part of the reason is that effectively what people like to criticize young people who make what are by all accounts decent salaries even for, you know, buying £6 lattes and spending money on eating out. But the point I always make is, well, the reality is that if the house you want to buy is more and more unaffordable every year, you might as well buy a £6 latte because saving those £6 is not going to get you to the point that you want. And so I see the rise of socialism. It's something I've been talking about for quite a while. I don't know if you ever caught my speech at the first ARC conference, but I talked at the very end of that about the fact that it's not going to be possible for conservatives. I was talking to an audience of largely conservatives, and I was saying to them, look, let me tell you, conservatives, something. You're not going to get young people to conserve a society that's not working for them. And so the rise of Mamdani, for me, is really fundamentally about the fact that life in the biggest cities in Western countries is becoming fundamentally unaffordable to young people who now have higher expectations, because Tony Blair in this country certainly wanted half of them to go to university where they got a degree that isn't now giving them a job. To the point now where we know that, you know, I talk to people, I know billionaires who don't send their children to universities because they think, what's the point? Right? So we've devalued university education, and the people who have one now have high expectations that are not commensurate with their ability to actually bring things to a job that's going to pay them the salary, combined with very high housing prices. And of course, you do have a lot of wealth inequality, which is always a big problem. That this is something the right doesn't really want to address, but is very, very important. Otherwise, you are going to get a lot of Mamdanis and AOCs and Jeremy Corbyns and Zara Sultana.
Yeah, you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana there. So let's talk about Britain, the country that must suffer those two individuals and many others as well. How do you think things are going here? I guess that's the question. We're a year into this Labour government. I I think it's fair to say it's been very patchy for them. I don't disapprove of your suggestion that we should let governments get on with it, see how they get on with it, and then issue our judgment when that time comes around. And I think it's pretty clear that they're not very popular. They're not doing a good job on the migration front. They're not doing a good job on the housing issue that you mentioned. They're not doing a good job on lots of things that people have expectations of them to do. What's your general taking of the temperature in relation to the Labour government right now?
Well, I don't look. I think the Labour government is largely an irrelevance. They are attempting to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic, to use that overused metaphor. And what I mean by that is, I just think the state of the economy is such that unless you're prepared to be radically honest with people and say to them, look, the solution to our problems is twofold. On the one hand, we need to create more jobs and we need to generate more revenue and business in the economy. And in order to do that, instead of having the statistic that we're losing more millionaires than any country in the world except China, now consider per capita, and you start to really get the picture. We are driving out people who are creating the jobs, historically speaking. And not only that, Brendan, anecdotally, I can tell you that we're also driving the people who are not currently wealthy, who will be creating the jobs over the next 10 years, except they're not going to be creating them here. They're going to be creating them in Dubai. They're going to be creating them in America. They're going to be creating them in other parts of the world where the business environment is much more favorable to them, where they're not going to get taxed to the eyeballs, when they're not going to be prevented from doing business. So that's the first part. And the second part, I'm afraid, is there's a deep dishonesty about whether we can afford to have the level of public spending that we have. And that includes the fact that hundreds of thousands of young people are now on unemployment benefit because they're depressed or because they're anxious or because there are other things. And I don't know about you. Of course, you've got to make this very clear. There are some people who are really badly disabled and need our support. There are some people who have clinical depression, for whom getting out of bed might be a challenge that they struggle with. But I can tell you that I've been depressed and anxious and many of those things at many points in my career, including when I was doing minimum wage jobs, when I couldn't finish my degree. My parents couldn't afford for me to finish university, and I just had to make my way in the world. And I remember going to employment offices and sweating and feeling really uncomfortable and being really anxious and, being depressed because I had a shitty job that I didn't like and all of those things. And the point is, that is part of life that you have to work through. You don't just sit on benefits because you don't feel comfortable. And far, far too many people in our country are now in that position. And they are in that position because we let them be in that position. Because we say, well, not allowing you to be in that position is cruel, it's unkind, you need support, and blah, 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 blah. And the truth is, we simply can't afford to do that. We simply can't afford to do that. So I don't see the Labour government. Look, they're not very competent. They're not very bright. There's a massive dearth of talent. Of course there is on the front bench. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is a woman who, I don't see any serious competence or personality there that's going to deal with these issues seriously. Their attempts to do so are backfiring because, of course, they promised all these things to their own fringe. And so the moment they try to cut any of the public spending we're talking about, these people start spitting the dummy out of the pram. The reality is, I think the problems in Britain are structural. I actually wrote an article a long time ago predicting all of this would happen, that all this wave of supposed enthusiasm would evaporate pretty quickly when we realized that the problems that Britain actually faces are structural in nature. And addressing them is going to be a big challenge. And I don't see this government as capable of doing anything about it significantly, which is why I must confess I'm becoming a bit of an accelerationist, Brendan, which is every time something goes wrong, I actually kind of deep down inside think it's probably a good thing, because come the next election, we at least will know that there's a real choice on the table. Either reform gets in and gets a chance to really shake things up, or is going to carry on like this forever. And I honestly don't think that Britain can sustain this for a very long time, because we are becoming a bit of a joke country.
It's so important to raise those structural questions, as you call them, because, there is a tendency for those questions to get lost in the discussions that we have about all the other swirling issues that, interrupt political life all the time. And I think you put that well there. But I do want to ask you, however, having said that, I want to ask you about a couple of the cultural, social issues that we face in this country that government and others have not done a good job of addressing. You might see these as structural issues as well, I don't know. But I did want to ask you about the grooming gangs phenomenon, or the rape gangs, as I think people now accept they should be called. You know, some of us have been talking about them for a long time, raising concerns about them. There are people who've been talking about it for longer even than you and I. You know, there have been people who've been blowing the whistle, going back years and years and years, and often being treated very badly for having done so. It still feels like, even though there's the promise of an inquiry, even though the government now finally seems to accept it, it's not far right to talk about this question, having said it was. It still seems like a very unresolved issue. It still seems like something the government is addressing under duress rather than willingly. What's your overview on that? How did this happen, and why does it feel, even now, still quite difficult to have an honest reckoning with ourselves about what happened?
Well, I think the answer to your question is contained within the way you asked it, which is, if it's still, after all this time, difficult for a Labour government to deal with it, that tells you quite a lot about why these things happened in the first place. Yeah. There was a culture of pretending this wasn't an issue. There was a culture of trying to protect the truth from being released to the public. There was a culture of victim blaming, let's be honest. There was a culture of attempting to suppress this information from coming out, because a lot of people would have egg on their face, and they thought that was more important than the mass rape of in many cases disadvantaged English British girls, and across the country. Right. It's a terrible crime, and what we really need is an inquiry that produces a kind of truth and reconciliation process. But in addition to reconciliation, I'd like there to be quite a lot of justice, Brendan. I want justice to be meted out to the people who were involved in this. I want justice to be meted out to the people who were involved in covering it up, ignoring it, concealing it from the public, and so on and so forth. I want to see deportations of the people we can deport. I want to see people stripped of their citizenship if they have dual nationality. I want the full force of the law to be applied here, and some very, very harsh sentences to be handed out. And I'm deeply unembarrassed about saying that I want the full force of the British criminal justice system to be applied. I want a lot of new criminal offences to be introduced around this issue, and this must never be allowed to happen again. And in order for that to happen, I think we have a long way to go.